Let's see if there is a Kuznets curve for environmental footprint. What is a Kuznets curve? It's basically this inverted U that is used in many processes, and basically it means there is certain process which has an impact which increases and then reaches maximum and then begins to drop off. So this is in the context of how would you think about redistributing the harm that is being created to the environment by our lifestyles, and how would you assign responsibility. So this is continuing the concept of where climate injustice comes from, right? So on this axis we have level of environmental degradation, and here on the abscissa we have GDP per capita, so it's some indicator of economic growth of a particular country. Generally, it was believed that when a country is poor and the per capita GDP is low, there is a low environmental degradation. Let's say tribes living in a forest, they are in some sort of a harmony with the environment from which they are making a living, like the forest gives them food, fiber, medicine, etc. There is a lot of debate about whether hunter-gatherers were really more environmentally conscious than us. But nonetheless, as the income goes up, energy consumption goes up, so you can think of it as pre-industrial economies which were obviously consuming at a much smaller scale, at least comparing to the global scale at which we grab resources right now, especially the rich countries, impacting timber from somewhere, food from somewhere, fruits from somewhere, vehicles from somewhere, electronics from somewhere, and so on. So the destruction of the environment happens somewhere else, and you are sitting here and consuming your fancy device or driving your fancy car, which may be a hybrid car. But where was it produced, and how much environmental footprint did it have? Those are the kind of questions, right? So pre-industrial economies came along, and then let's say industrial economics took over. So the idea is that there was a turning point, and then post-industrial service sector continued to increase the per capita GDP, but did the level of environmental degradation go down? So this is the Kuznets curve. And is there really a Kuznets curve for the environmental footprint? It's not entirely clear, because as we will see in a minute, the per capita emission is still very high for rich countries which are in the full-blown industrial economics, and it's much lower for countries that have much less of a westernized lifestyle in terms of comforts and industrial products, let's say. Okay, so that's the big question. Do we really tend to go along this curve, or is there a way to motivate lower environmental degradation for rich people who have higher per capita GDP? But this goes back to the issues we discussed before, that everybody understands the concept of saving for the future money, but not necessarily saving the environment for the future. There are details, of course. Even if somebody accepts that future must be saved, environment must be saved for the future, they don't necessarily follow up on all the actions. There are things like one action bias and so on, which we will not get into. For example, somebody may buy a hybrid car and feel happy that they did something for the environment, but they don't necessarily reduce their meat consumption, which is very bad for the environment. Okay, I've said this before in other podcasts, and I never get tired of saying this. For example, a person who's driving a hybrid car, which is good for the environment, can still have a bigger carbon footprint than a person driving an SUV, which obviously is a monstrosity and bad for the environment compared to the hybrid. But the SUV person may be a vegetarian, whereas the hybrid car driver may be a heavy meat consumer. So You might end up having a lower footprint for a guy who's driving SUV but managing other things better than a person who's driving a hybrid but consuming lots of other lifestyle products. Okay, so we need to have a portfolio to look at our carbon footprint and manage it in a way to redistribute the harms and responsibilities. This is the key thing. Okay, the other issue that always comes up is population and CO2 emissions. These kind of plots which show world population increase and carbon dioxide emission increase looks like there is a strong relation between them. Is that really true? Is population so directly driving increases in total CO2 emissions? What do you have to look at? You have to look at per capita emission, right? And total population. For example, India has 3 times the population or even 4 times the population of the US. And US per capita emission is almost 6 or 7 times that of India. So you more than compensate for the footprint, right? So we will look in the next podcast at something called an IPAT model, which looks at the impact in terms of population, technology, and wealth, and see how the actual total emission comes about. That could be important because just saying reduce population may not be a solution. Actually, already population fertility rates have been dropping for a couple of decades. Why? The biggest factor is education of women. Okay, as soon as you educate women, the fertility rates begin to drop. That's the best contraception in many ways. Okay, so these are the things we have to worry about when we want to actually look at redistributing the harms to the environment and assigning responsibilities. We cannot just look at population increase, emission increase, and say reduce population. We will see additional factors involved in there. Does a woman who have fewer kids actually have a lower footprint? It turns out not, because she has fewer kids to give each kid more resources, more wealth, so that they can do better in life, which automatically comes with increased carbon footprint. So unless we reduce the emission per capita, reducing population may not help. As we already saw, top 10% is emitting 50% of the lifestyle emissions compared to the bottom 50% of the poor people. They're emitting only about 10%. So this is where population discussions have to be done very carefully. So we'll look at some of the details in the next podcast.